"I don't need a schoolteacher," Wick Dolan said. "I need someone who can keep a house and not bolt when the river comes up." Lorna Briggs had just stepped down from Pauline Garver's wagon. Her boots were already muddy from the dock road, and the Oregon drizzle, patient, indifferent, was still coming down the way it always did on the coast, as if it had nowhere better to be. She set her carpet bag down in the yard, straightened her coat with both hands, and looked at the man who had written her a letter in November. Same handwriting, same bluntness. She had expected at least that much. "Then let me keep it," she said. "The river will handle when it rises." He looked at her in the way a man looks at something that didn't arrive as ordered. Then he turned and walked back toward the orchard without another word, and without offering to carry anything. She picked up the bag herself. Pauline Garver made a sound from the wagon seat that might have been sympathy, or might have been warning. "He was different before Helen," she said. "How long ago?" Lorna asked. 3 years this February. Pauline gathered her reins, give or take. Lorna thanked her, watched the wagon disappear down the muddy track between the fir trees, and then turned to look at the house properly. It was larger than the letter had made it sound. A 2-story farmhouse at the edge of the Dolan orchard, apple trees running in gray November rows up the hillside behind it, the Columbia River a broad pewter strip in the distance below. The bones of the place were good. Solid timber, deep porch, windows that had once been washed regularly and hadn't been in some time. A rocking chair sat at the far end of the porch with an old wool blanket draped over its back, bleached by weather. A pair of small boots, a child's, worn at the toes, sat beside the front door like someone had set them there in a hurry and hadn't come back to put them away. No child in sight. She went inside. The kitchen was the first room she saw, and the first room she understood. Not neglected exactly. The dishes were washed, the floor had been swept recently enough, but empty in the particular way of rooms where no one lingers. A woman's apron hung on a hook beside the stove, faded blue cotton, the strings still knotted. A tin of dried herbs sat on the shelf above the dry goods with Helen Dolan written on it in careful letters in someone else's hand. Lorna looked at it for a moment, then looked away. She took off her coat, hung it on an empty hook, rolled up her sleeves, and started a fire. She found provisions in the larder: salt pork, dried beans, a half-wheel of hard cheese, potatoes going slightly soft, and made a soup that asked nothing of anyone, hearty and plain. The kind of meal you made when you needed to demonstrate you were capable without making anyone feel watched. When supper was ready, she set the table the way her mother had insisted, plate centered, spoon laid straight, a cup of water even if no one would drink it. Wick came in just after dark, bringing the smell of cold air and wet bark with him. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw the table set, and something moved across his face too quickly to catch. Something between recognition and pain, and then it was gone. He sat down. He ate. He said nothing. They sat across from each other in a silence so complete Lorna could hear the fire settling. She ate steadily, not filling the quiet with conversation. Forced talk was worse than none. She had learned that before in other rooms with other silences that didn't belong to her. It was Wick who spoke first. "Soup's good," he said flatly, the way a man notes weather. "Thank you," she said. A pause, the kind that had weight in it. "You cook like this back in Ohio?" he asked. "My mother taught me," she said. She believed a good meal was the one honest kindness left when everything else had gone complicated. He said nothing to that. But he finished every drop of the soup, and when he pushed back from the table, he paused for just a beat before standing. "Early start," he said. "The upper rows need turning before the frost comes back." "I'll have breakfast ready by first light," she said. He nodded once and left. Lorna sat alone at the table for a while, listening to the house settle around her, the creak of old timber, the distant sound of the river, the enormous Oregon dark pressing softly against the windows. She wrapped both hands around her cooling coffee and let herself feel all of it at once, the strangeness, the uncertainty, the particular loneliness of a place that had belonged to someone else first. And then she put it all back in the place she kept such things and went to wash the dishes. She had known it wouldn't be easy. She had not been wrong. The boy appeared the next morning. She heard him before she saw him, small boots on the stairs, then a deliberate silence that meant he'd stopped and was listening. She kept her back to the doorway, stirring the oatmeal on the stove, letting him decide. He came in eventually. 7 years old, dark-haired like his father, with the careful measuring eyes of a child who had learned that new things sometimes disappeared and was not yet willing to invest in her. He sat down at the table without being asked, picked up his spoon, and looked at the bowl she set in front of him with the expression of a judge reviewing evidence. He ate without speaking. "I'm Lorna," she said, sitting down across from him. He looked up, his jaw tightened very slightly. "I know," he said. "And you're Ben." He looked back at his oatmeal. She didn't push. She ate her breakfast and let the quiet be what it was. He left before she finished, boots already on by the time she heard the back door. She watched him cross the yard toward the barn and disappear inside without looking back. She finished her oatmeal. She cleared the table. She started on the house. There was plenty to start on. She found a bin of mending that had been accumulating since at least spring. She found a cracked window latch in the larder that had been letting cold air in all season, and fixed it with a tool from the woodshed using a technique her uncle had shown her when she was 9. She reorganized the dry goods, not because the organization had been wrong, but because it had stopped being anyone's concern, and things that weren't anyone's concern had a way of quietly failing. Wick watched her the way he watched everything, from a distance, without commentary. Pauline Garver came by on the 3rd day with a jar of preserved plums and a look that was doing more work than the plums. "Most women who come up here," Pauline said, sitting down without being asked, "leave before the first month's out. The isolation gets them. Or Wick does." She tilted her head. "No offense to Wick." "None taken on his behalf," Lorna said. Pauline smiled at that. "You fixed the latch in the larder." It was letting in the cold. "It's been letting in the cold for 2 winters." Lorna poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down, then it was past time. The older woman looked at her with the frank assessment of someone who had been watching this stretch of the Columbia long enough to know what survived and what didn't. "Why are you still here?" she asked, and it wasn't unkind. Lorna thought about it honestly. "Because leaving is the easy thing," she said, "and I have never been especially talented at easy things." The breaking point came on a Wednesday, 11 days in. She had been watching Ben. Not conspicuously. She was careful about that, careful the way you had to be with a child who had learned to interpret attention as a precursor to something unwanted. But she watched, and what she saw worried her in a quiet, specific way. He avoided letters. Not books themselves. She had found him looking at the illustrations in an old natural history volume his mother had clearly loved, running his finger along the drawings with something close to reverence. But whenever print was required, whenever words were demanded, he went still in a particular way, like a person who has heard something they aren't sure of and is deciding whether to run. She asked Pauline, obliquely, what the schoolmaster in Astoria had said about Ben. Pauline's expression answered before her words did. "Mr. Vickers told Wick the boy was slow," she said carefully, said it plainly. Said some children just don't take to reading, suggested Wick not push. Lorna did not say what she thought about that. She thanked her, and she thought about it for 2 days, and then on Wednesday morning she sat down beside Ben at the kitchen table, with a piece of paper and a pencil. "Show me how you read this," she said, pushing the paper toward him. She had written a simple sentence. "The dog ran fast." He looked at it. His jaw went tight the way his father's did. "I'm not in school," he said. "No," she agreed. "This isn't school. I'm just curious how you see it." He looked at her suspiciously. Then he looked at the paper. She watched his eyes move across the letters and saw the slight flinch, the realignment, the way a person moves when familiar terrain turns unreliable underfoot. "The letters move," he said finally, and said it low, like a confession, like he had said it before and been told he was making excuses. Something clicked into place in Lorna's chest, clean and certain. "I know," she said. "Not everyone sees them the same way." She turned the paper over. "Let me show you something." She worked with him for an hour, and it was not like any lesson Mr. Vickers had given him. She traced letters with her finger, said them aloud, built words from sound first and let the visual follow. She had read about this once, a single paper in the Columbus Library, written by a physician in London who believed some children's eyes and minds processed print differently. Not wrongly, just differently. She had read it with the focused attention of someone who recognized something they would need later, and hadn't yet known for what. Ben did not suddenly learn to read that morning, but he looked up at the end of the hour with something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not gratitude exactly. Not yet. Something more fundamental than gratitude. The particular relief of a child who has been telling the truth about something and has finally been believed. She did not say anything to Wick that day, but Wick came in from the orchard at dusk and stood looking at the paper on the table, covered in traced letters, without picking it up. "What's this?" he said. "Ben and I were working," she said. Wick turned to look at her. His expression was not closed in the way it usually was. Something in it was careful and present. "Vickers said it wasn't worth pushing," he said. "Mr. Vickers is wrong," she said without apology. "Ben isn't slow. His eyes and mind process letters differently. It's a known phenomenon. It can be worked with. It requires patience and a different approach. But he can learn to read, Wick. He wants to. He's been ashamed of not being able to, which is entirely the wrong thing for a 7-year-old to carry." Wick was quiet. He looked at the paper again. "You figured all that out in one morning," he said. "I figured it out in the first week," she said. "I spent the next few days deciding how to say it." Something moved in his face, the jaw released a fraction, just that. "All right," he said. They ate supper. Ben ate with them, quiet the way he was always quiet, but with something different in the quiet. He looked up once, quickly, when Lorna passed the bread. She looked back without making anything of it. He looked down again. Wick noticed. She knew he noticed. That night, after Ben had gone up to bed, she found Wick on the porch. He was sitting in the wooden chair beside the rocking chair. Never in the rocking chair itself she had noticed. That one sat untouched, the wool blanket still draped over its back, collecting river damp. She stood in the doorway. He didn't tell her to go in. "Helen used to sit out here," he said, without her asking. "Even in the cold." She said the river air helped her think. Lorna leaned against the door frame. The Columbia was a dim silver line through the firs below. "What was she like?" she said. He looked at the rocking chair. "Certain," he said at last. "She always knew what the right thing was. I used to argue with her just to see if I could move her, and I almost never could." Something small moved across his face. Ben has it, that same certainty. He knows exactly what he thinks even when he can't say it yet. "He'll be able to say it," Lorna said. "Give him time." Wick looked at the river. "She died in the 3rd week of February," he said. "Fever. It came fast." His voice was level, but it was costing him something. Ben was 4. He doesn't remember as much as he thinks he does. What he has isn't quite right anymore, the way memory works on children. I don't correct him. I figure whatever version he has is his. "That's the right instinct," Lorna said quietly. He turned and looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he hadn't since she'd arrived. "Why does it matter to you?" he said. "What you said about Ben, the way you said it, like it was personal." She was quiet for a moment. "In Columbus," she said, "I had 23 students. 2 of them were like Ben. I watched the first one get told for 3 years that she was simple, and I watched what that did to her. By the time she was 9, she believed it." She held his gaze. "I reported the school board member who had set that policy, the one that called children like her hopeless, and moved them to the back of the room. It cost me my position." Wick was still. "That's why you answered my letter," he said. "That's part of it," she said. He said nothing for a long time. The river moved below them, dark and steady and indifferent. "Come inside," he said finally. "You'll freeze." She came inside. It was not a conversion, not that night. But something had moved between them that hadn't been there before, and in a place as closed as Wick Dolan had become, even a small thing moving was something to pay attention to. The letter arrived from Astoria 3 weeks later. Pauline brought it herself, which told Lorna it was bad before she said a word. She came in the mid-morning with a jar of coffee and set it on the table without sitting down, and looked at Lorna with an expression that had something apologetic in it, and something else she couldn't name. "There's a thing being talked about in town," Pauline said. "About you." The letter was from a member of the Astoria School Board, a man named Garrett Hughes, whose cousin had served on the Columbus School Board under Superintendent Lyle Coombs, the same superintendent who had dismissed her. The letter, which Pauline had heard read aloud at the general store and which was now apparently making the rounds with some enthusiasm, described Lorna as a woman of poor professional character who had caused disruption and division in a school system and been asked to leave. It did not mention that she had been asked to leave because she had reported Coombs for redirecting school funds into his own accounting. It did not mention the two parents who had written letters in her support that had been ignored. It mentioned none of the things that had actually happened, and instead used the architecture of language that respectable men use when they want to damage someone without technically lying. Lorna sat with it for a moment. Then she asked what people were saying. Pauline's expression answered before she did. She told Wick that evening. All of it, the original incident, what Coombs had done, what she had done in response, what it had cost her, and what the letter to the Astoria board had said and left out. She told it plainly, without drama, because plain telling was the only kind that held up. When she finished, Wick sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood. "I have proof," she said. She went to her trunk and came back with a letter, her copy of the complaint she had filed with the Ohio State Education Office and the response acknowledging receipt. She laid it on the table. "If you want to verify it, that's the document." He looked at the papers without picking them up. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he said. No accusation in it, just the honest question. "Because it was my past to disclose on my own terms," she said, "and because I needed you to know who I was before you knew what had happened to me." He looked at her, a long, specific look. "You think there's a difference," he said. "I know there is," she said. "I watched you understand it when Pauline told you about Helen. You wanted to know who she was, not just what happened to her." He was quiet. Then he picked up the letter from the state education office and read it. She watched his face for what the words did to it. His jaw tightened once, midway through. "Coombs filed a counter-complaint," he said. "Which the state office declined to pursue," she said. Third paragraph. He read it. He set it down. "There's a board meeting Friday," he said. "I know," she said. "Pauline told me." "I'm going," he said. She looked at him. "To say what?" she asked carefully. He met her eyes. "To say what needs to be said, and to let anyone who wants to argue with the documentation do their arguing to my face." She did not tell him what that meant to her. She was reasonably certain that Wick Dolan, like most things worth trusting, operated better when not asked to perform its meaning out loud. "All right," she said. Friday came. She did not go to the meeting. That had been Wick's suggestion, and she had agreed because she understood the logic. The story needed to be told by the person the town already trusted, not by the person they were currently doubting. It had cost her something to sit at the kitchen table and wait, but she had been paying for things with her dignity for long enough that she knew the difference between the costs worth bearing and the ones that simply ground you down. Ben sat across from her. He had his paper in front of him, the one she had written his letters on, and he was tracing them with his tongue pressing the corner of his lip the way it did when he was concentrating. She did not interrupt him. She drank her coffee and let him work. After a while he said, without looking up, "Did you get in trouble because of me?" She looked at him. "No," she said. He kept tracing. "Because of the letters stuff?" "No," she said. "That trouble was from a long time ago, before I came here." He considered this. "But now it followed you." "Sometimes things do," she said. He was quiet then. "Papa followed my mother," he said. "After she died, he said she follows him in the morning when the light looks the way it did the first day they came here." He looked up, and his eyes were very direct. "Is that a bad kind of following or a good kind?" She thought about Helen Dolan's apron on its hook, the rocking chair on the porch, the wool blanket going soft with river air. "A good kind," she said. "The kind that means someone mattered." Ben looked back at his paper. Wick came home at 9:30 with the quiet purposefulness of a man who had done a thing and was not interested in dramatizing it. He came in, set his hat on the hook, and sat down at the table. "Hughes pulled the letter," he said. "Board voted to dismiss the complaint, 3-1, a pause. The Garver boy was there. Pauline's son. I didn't know he was in Astoria. He came on his own. Said you were the reason he stayed in school." Something moved in Wick's face. The expression of a man who has discovered the ground is firmer than he thought. He said it to anyone who'd listen. She looked at the table. She pressed her hands flat against it. "I didn't know he was here," she said. "He's been working the mill up the river 2 years," Wick said. "Turns out Astoria is a smaller place than Coombs calculated." She let out a breath. They sat in the quiet of the kitchen for a while. Outside, the river was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent and continuous, the way water moves when it has somewhere to be. It was Ben who moved the rocking chair. Not that night, but 3 days later, on a Sunday morning when the first hard frost had turned the apple trees silver and the porch was too cold to use. Lorna heard the scrape of something heavy and looked out the kitchen window to see Ben, in his coat and boots, wearing the concentrated look he wore when he had decided something, dragging the rocking chair across the porch toward the front door. She stood very still. Wick appeared at her elbow. He had come from somewhere else in the house and stood beside her at the window, watching his son without speaking. She could feel the stillness in him, the particular stillness of a man watching something he wasn't prepared for and finding that it was all right anyway. Ben got the chair through the door. He looked around the front room, decided, and set it beside the fireplace. Then he went back to the porch, collected the wool blanket, carried it inside, and draped it over the back the way it had always been draped. He stood back and looked at it for a moment, with the satisfied expression of someone who has put something in its right place. Then he went upstairs without explaining himself to anyone. Wick stood very still for a long time. "She would have liked you," he said finally. He said it the way he said all the things that cost him most, plain, without inflation, trusting the words to carry what they meant without embellishment. Lorna didn't look at him right away. She looked at the rocking chair in its new place, the wool blanket, the fire starting to warm the room. "I know she loved him well," she said. "I can tell from who he's becoming." Wick was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her, the full, unguarded look she had seen only in pieces before, never all at once. She had been learning his language for 2 months, the language of silence and action, and things said in the space between words. She had become fluent enough to know what this one meant. "Stay," he said. Not a question, not an order, something simpler than either. A choice offered by a man who had stopped pretending he didn't want her to make it. She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He nodded once, slowly, and reached out and took her hand the way he did things, without ceremony, as if it were a fact that had simply stopped being deniable. He held it. He did not let go. They stood that way for a while in the warm front room of the Dolan house, with the Columbia running below the hill and the frost on the apple trees outside, and the rocking chair finally brought in from the cold. The apples came in that fall in better numbers than they had in 3 years. Lorna had noticed in the spring that 2 rows of the upper orchard had been improperly pruned. Not through carelessness, but through the particular inattention of a man who had stopped investing in futures. She had asked Wick about it carefully, and he had looked at the rows for a moment with an expression she recognized, and then he had gone to the barn and come back with the pruning tools and spent 2 days correcting it, working beside her, without explanation. That was how they did most things. Together, without ceremony, the practical architecture of a shared life built one task at a time. Ben learned to read that winter. Haltingly at first then, with increasing confidence as the method Lorna had built for him settled into habit. He would always read slowly, but he read. He came home from the Astoria schoolhouse one Thursday in January with a paper marked at the top in the teacher's careful notation. Good. He put it on the kitchen table where Lorna would see it. He didn't say anything about it. He went to wash up for supper. She looked at the paper for a long time. Then she put it on the shelf beside the window, next to the tin of dried herbs with Helen's handwriting on it, because some things deserved to stand together. Wick proposed in the orchard. It was September, harvest time, the air smelling of apples and wood smoke and the particular clean sharpness of the river in autumn. He came and found her working the lower row with a basket, and he stood for a moment without speaking, which was his customary prelude to the things that mattered most. "I want to do this properly," he said. "What we have, I want to mean it the right way." She looked at him. A man rebuilt from the ground up, still showing the history of the work. "You already do," she said. "I want to say it out loud anyway," he said. So she let him. She said yes, and she meant it, and neither of them made more of it than it was, which was already more than enough. The wedding was small. Pauline, her son from the mill, Dottie from the general store, who had come around entirely after watching Lorna work for 6 months, and had decided, in the direct way of women who had seen enough of the world to trust their own assessment, that this one was the keeping kind. a few neighbors from the valley. The circuit preacher who made the run up the river every other month and said the words with the practical warmth of a man who had seen enough marriages go wrong to be genuinely glad when two people came to him who looked like they meant it. Ben stood beside his father. He had put on his good shirt without being asked. Afterward, he came and stood beside Lorna, while the neighbors ate the food Pauline had brought. He stood close enough that his shoulder pressed against her arm, which was as much as Ben Dolan showed of the things he felt, and she understood it was exactly what it looked like. She looked down at him. He looked up. They stood that way for a moment, the three of them in the apple orchard, the river below, the Oregon sky enormous and clear and full of itself the way it always was on the coast, holding everything under it with the same vast patient grace, the grief that doesn't end, the life that keeps going, the particular stubborn love of people who have lost and are choosing, in spite of that loss and because of it, to begin again. Lorna Briggs had not come to the Oregon coast expecting much. She had come because the alternative was to stay in a place that had already told her what it thought of her worth, and she had never been the kind of person who took other people's definitions of her as the final word. She had gotten off the steamer in the November drizzle and ridden 4 miles up a muddy track to a house with a cold kitchen, and a rocking chair no one would sit in, and a boy who looked at her like a problem, and a man who looked at her the same way. She had lit the fire. That was all you ever had to do in the end. Find the cold room, light the fire, stay long enough for the warmth to become ordinary. She was still there. She intended to remain.